It's been a while since I made one of these, so let's talk about some books that I've read recently. And by recently, I mean in the last 4 or 5 months. So to start off with this pile of 5 books, I will link a video up here in the cards and down in the description because these are books I read back in October of 2020, and I made a video all about them where I read spooky, scary books in October, and I read all of these and reviewed all of these in that video. So if you want to know my thoughts on Murder on the Orient Express, The Shining, The Devouring Grey, If We Were Villains, and My Best Friend's Exorcism, please go watch that video after you've watched this one, because I don't want to repeat myself too much, because there's not much more I can say that I didn't say in that video. Okay, and then the other books that I'm going to talk about in this video, I will start talking about them from my lowest rated to my most highly rated. Okay, so starting with books I gave 2 stars to, so books I did not like very much. The first one is A Deadly Education by Naomi Novik. Now, I also have a full reading vlog / review of this, which I will also link in the cards and down in the description. I did not like this book. I had a lot of issues with it, which I go into in that video. So if you're interested to know what those issues are, again, please watch my full reading vlog and review of this book. I was very excited when I first received this book. I pre-ordered it. I really liked that it tackled a Romanian myth, the Sholomance legend, but ultimately I was really disappointed in the way Naomi Novik handled everything. I think this had a lot of potential, but ultimately it just didn't deliver. I didn't like this. I will continue on with the trilogy just because I'm hoping she will improve, because the premise of this is still really, really cool. And that premise is basically the Sholomance is a dark school of magic that is trying to kill its students. And in order to graduate from this school of magic, you basically have to survive long enough to graduate. And the actual graduation ceremony is another fight to the death, pretty much. So that premise, amazing. The execution of it, not so much. Alright, the next book is a book I read for a challenge that I put on myself. No one made me do this. But just in case you're wondering, this is a very, very different book than the kinds of books I usually read. My video on reading 2 books called Stardust should be up by the time I'm uploading this video. And so if you're wondering what I'm talking about, again, I'll link that video up in the cards and down in the description. But this is called Stardust by Carla Stewart, and I had no idea going into this what this book would be about. It turned out to be sort of a Christian historical fiction novel. It was fine, but it was really not my kind of thing. Basically, the main character in the beginning, her husband dies and she is left with 2 kids, and she is a housewife in the 1950s in Texas while the polio outbreak is a thing, high 2021, and she is left with a hotel called Stardust that's kind of in disrepair, and it's up to her to repair it and bring it back to its former glory and sort of turn it into a business. I only read this because of a challenge, but yeah, I gave this 2 out of 5 stars. Next up is A Dance of Thieves by Mary E. Pearson, and I gave this 3 out of 5 stars. This is a fantasy romance novel. That's kind of the reason why I gave it 3 stars, is because I wasn't aware at the time of picking this up that it was a fantasy romance. I thought it was going to be more fantasy than romance, but no, it's definitely a fantasy novel just set in a fantasy type of setting. But for a romance novel, I think it did its job. So if you're into romance, and especially enemies to lovers trope, this is that, and I think it's done really well, and I enjoyed reading it for sure. Like, I enjoyed the romance aspect of it. I actually really enjoyed the writing as well. It just wasn't much more than romance because it is a romance novel, but that's not what I was expecting. Does this make any sense to anyone other than me? Probably not. Anyway, it was fine, but if you're not into the romance subgenre of fantasy, then I would give this one a skip. Next up, I listened to an audiobook called The Short History of Nearly Everything by Bill Bryson. Now, I've talked about Bill Bryson a lot on my channel. I started listening to his books, I think, last year, and I've read a lot of his books now. I have most of them on Audible. I prefer listening to them because most of them are narrated by Bill Bryson himself. This one, however, wasn't. This was interesting. However, I think it was published around 2004 or the early 2000s, so at this point it's actually really outdated. But basically, this is what it says on the tin. It's a history of almost everything with very short introductions to most things. This one wasn't that funny, really. It was just a lot of facts, a lot of information. And, if you're looking for that, then I think it's great. But I would just say it's outdated. And I think there are better books handling these topics out there these days, including some from Bill Bryson himself. I mean, he wrote an entire book about medicine and the body. That one I really, really highly recommend. I love that one. Yeah, this one is just not one of my favorites of his, even though it's really, really popular. Next, I have a contemporary novel, and that is I Wish You All the Best by Mason Deaver. This is a queer story about a non-binary main character. At the beginning of this book, the main character is coming out to their parents, and this is something that they've been dreading, but they've been really, really wanting to do. It's kind of their first step in accepting who they really are. But it turns out that their parents are not okay with that at all, and their parents kick them out. And then it's up to them to figure out what to do next. I don't want to spoil anything more than that. It's definitely a romance story, but it also handles theme of coming of age and obviously of sort of getting to know one's true personality and what they really want in life. And as an LGBTQIA story, I think this was amazing. The fact that it's about a non-binary character, I don't think there was a lot of books out there about that. And I think this is going to help a lot of people, especially teenagers, picking this up and reading about a non-binary character. And maybe that'll answer some questions that they've had about themselves for a long time. But I just think the overall plot wasn't anything special. It was very simple. I wasn't a huge fan of the prose. It was almost too bare bones, too simple. I think it could have been written a bit better, in my opinion, to have more depth, to have more layers to it. But I just feel like it was a bit superficial in its writing and its plot. But again, the subject matter, I think, is awesome. I'm really happy that these kinds of books exist, and I think there should be more of them. But I do think this is really, really important. I would highly recommend it, especially for young readers. I think this is a really, really important book. Another YA contemporary, this is We Are Okay by Nina LaCour. This is a really short, fast read, and I really, really enjoyed this. This, again, handled a lot of important themes. It's also an LGBTQIA story, and it also handles mental health. As opposed to the one I showed you previously, the writing in this is beautiful, and this book really made me feel for these characters. This handles really important themes of grief. The main character's grandfather, who was their primary caregiver, dies at the beginning or prior to the beginning of this book, and the whole book sort of follows the main character's processing of her grandfather's passing, and also handles themes of identity and coming of age and accepting one's true self. Then I have a middle grade / young adult fantasy novel, and this is The Iron Trial, the first book in the Magisterium series by Holly Black and Cassandra Clare. So this is a co-authored book, and it's very, very similar to the whole sort of Harry Potter, magical academy trope, but I think it was done really well. And the fact that it's co-authored, I think that was done really well. I'm always a bit wary about co-authored books because they can be a bit disjointed, but I think this one flowed really, really well, and you couldn't really tell, honestly, that it was written by two different authors. So the Magisterium is this sort of dark academy of magic that is very, very difficult to get into, and the main character sort of falls into this world without him really wanting to or searching it out. Even though this handles very familiar tropes, it has like a trio of main characters like Harry, Ron, and Hermione. It handles very familiar themes, but I do think it turns a lot of the tropes on their heads. I'm not gonna say how, but I do think it has some interesting twists and turns to the usual familiar tropes that you would expect with this kind of story, and for that I really enjoyed it. Plus the voice was really fun to follow. It definitely has more of that middle grade type of feel and humor to it, but it was super enjoyable and really, really quick to read, and I had a lot of fun reading it. And there are 4 more books in the series. I think there are 5 books in total. So I'm definitely going to continue on and reading this whole series at some point. Okay, almost there. The second to last book I want to talk about is a very recent book that I just finished reading, and that is The Other Stardust. This is Stardust by Neil Gaiman. So again, this one I read because of that reading 2 books with the same title challenge. This is a book that I've been wanting to read for a long time because Neil Gaiman is just an author that I've really enjoyed his books previously, and I want now to read everything that he's ever written because I love this. This was so good. I gave this like 4.5 out of 5 stars. This is fantastic. This is a fantasy fairy tale for adults. I chuckled so much reading this book. It was so funny and so heartwarming. It's almost a parody of fantasy and fairy tales. It kind of throws everything, all the elements of a fantasy fairy tale in here, but it handles everything with such humor and wit in a way that is not annoying, because when something is trying to parody something else, it kind of becomes a bit obnoxious. This handles it so well, and you really feel for these characters and for their story. At the beginning of the book, there's this boy who falls in love with a girl from the village, and in order to win the girl's heart, he must retrieve a fallen star. When they were talking, there was this falling star that they both saw on the horizon, and the girl was like, "You go get that for me, and then we'll talk about it." He takes this to heart, and he goes into fairyland to retrieve this fallen star for this girl, and he basically starts an adventure from there. It was fantastic. I would so highly recommend this. I love Neil Gaiman's writing style, and I definitely want to read more of his books. Okay, and the last book I'm going to talk about in this video is actually the only book that I've given 5 stars to from this video, isn't it? I think so. Yeah, I've definitely become more stingy with 5-star ratings, but anyway, this definitely deserves it. This is Oathbringer by Brandon Sanderson, the 3rd book in the epic Stormlight Archive fantasy series. I have a full spoiler-free book review of this if you want to hear my full thoughts on it. So again, I will link that video in the cards and down in the description. I love this, obviously. It took me a long time to get to it because I wanted this mass market paperback edition, and they didn't release it until like 2 years after the book published or something like that. And then it took me a little longer to actually pick it up, and then it took me a while longer to actually get through it and read it. I think it took me about 2 months to read it in its entirety because it's very dense. This is one of the longest books I've ever read, if not the longest book. I'm not entirely sure of the word count, but in pages, it's 1,300 pages, Bible thin pages, and I'm pretty sure this is actually longer than Words of Radiance, the 2nd book in the series, which was also like insanely long. They are really thick and dense books, but they are amazing. This is epic fantasy at its finest. These are some of the best characters I've ever read. Brandon Sanderson really handles themes that I feel like a lot of authors shy away from. Mental health, for example. I think in this book specifically, I think there's so many amazing showcases of mental health. It's just great. I love these characters so much, and I cannot wait to read the 4th book, Rhythm of War. But again, I think I will wait for them to come out with this edition of it, which is probably going to take some time. But I would so highly recommend the series if you haven't started already. I think this is a good time because the first 4 books are now all out, and I think he's going to definitely take some time before releasing the next ones. So I think it's a good time to catch up, and it's gonna take you a while to catch up because, like I said, these are quite hefty tomes to get through, let me say that. But definitely recommend this if you enjoy world building and magic systems in your fantasy. I mean, why are you reading fantasy if you don't? But if you do, Sanderson is your man. So definitely check this out. Okay, so if I can actually pick these up, these are all of the books that I have read in the last few months, and I know it's been a while since I've made one of these videos. I apologize. Yeah, this is a big ol' stack of books that is going to fall soon. So yeah, that was my recent reads wrap up. Do let me know if you've read any of these books and what you thought of them, and if any of them sound interesting to you and you're interested in picking them up, you can find links to all the books that I've mentioned in this video down in the description. Otherwise, yeah, let me know what was the most recent book that you've read and really loved. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time with a new video. Bye!